Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, the articles, the research, notes you've gathered, and we really try to dig in.
Yeah, we sift through it all, looking for those key nuggets of insight.
Exactly. The idea is to give you that shortcut, help you get informed quickly, maybe uncover some surprising things, and, see things from a slightly different angle.
And we're your guides for this. We look through the material you shared, which, by the way, included perspectives from some really knowledgeable people who've discussed this, like Muki Tenenbaum, who's a world expert on AI and geopolitics, and Claudio Zucevicchi, a top economist in Argentine media, known for his financial market insights.
And today, what we're diving into is, well, it's fascinating and honestly a bit mind-boggling. It's the incredible power of just one company, TSMC.
Right. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company.
We're going to unpack the sources you sent, try to figure out how this one firm got so essential that it's tangled up in global politics, how it could actually stand up to a superpower.
Yeah, what makes it so unique and what does it all mean for the economy, geopolitics?
And for you, really, because it does affect you.
Definitely. Get ready for some insights that might challenge how you think about monopolies, security, technology's future. Let's jump in.
Okay, so right off the bat, the sources hammer home TSMC's position. It's described as one of the world's strongest monopolies, hugely profitable, incredibly hard to displace.
But here's the interesting twist, right? It's a monopoly built almost purely on being the best, on sheer competitiveness.
Yeah, it's not like they bought everyone out or used unfair tricks. They just got incredibly good at what they do.
Exactly. They have this lead others just can't seem to close right now. And what they do is, well, it's vital. They make the most advanced semiconductor chips, period.
These tiny things that are basically the brains behind, well, everything cutting edge. AI, self-driving cars.
Your smartphone, military tech, supercomputers. You name it.
And here's the crucial point, the real linchpin of their power that comes through in your material. If TSMC doesn't make these specific super advanced chips,
you just don't exist.
Yeah.
Not at that level. Not at the bleeding edge. For many critical parts, TSMC is the only source, full stop.
Just think about that. The only place.
And the sources are clear, trying to catch up. The barrier is just immense. Staggering.
How long are we talking?
We're looking at 10, maybe 15 years. Could be even longer, realistically, to build a company that could truly compete at TSMC's level.
So a quick challenge is just impossible.
Pretty much, yeah. Forget about it.
Okay, so this kind of unique, dominant position, it led to a really striking clash mentioned in your sources, particularly involving the Trump administration.
Right. This is where that power really got put to the test very publicly. The story goes, the Trump administration put enormous pressure on TSMC.
What was the demand?
It was pretty blunt.
Yeah.
Move all your production to the United States.
All of it. Wow.
Yeah. And the threat. Tariffs, if they didn't play ball, it was that kind of my way or the highway approach.
Okay, and here's the part that really stands out, isn't it? Most companies facing that kind of heat from the U.S. government, they tend to fold, or at least compromise heavily.
But TSMC didn't. They pushed back. They resisted the full demand.
How? How did they pull that off?
Well, basically their indispensability was their leverage, their shield, you could say. Now, they did agree to something significant. They agreed to build factories, these fabs, in Arizona.
Right, I saw that. A major investment.
Huge. But, and this is the key point, they did not agree to move everything. It was a strategic concession, sure, but definitely not giving in completely to the original demand.
And one big consequence of building those U.S. factories, according to the sources, the chips made there are going to cost more.
Significantly more. Roughly 30% higher cost is the figure mentioned.
Why such a big jump?
Well, Tenenbaum, in discussing this, pointed mainly to higher labor costs in the U.S. versus Taiwan. That's a big piece.
Okay, that makes sense.
But it's also about, differences in the work culture, productivity expectations. The sources mentioned that in Taiwan's semiconductor industry, working 6, even 7 days a week, 12-hour days, it's much more the norm than in the U.S.
Right, that cultural difference is huge in manufacturing. But Tenenbaum's perspective, as noted, also suggested that, okay, 30% is a lot, but...
But in the grand scheme of the final product, cost like a new iPhone or a cutting-edge AI server, maybe it's relatively small, especially when you absolutely need that chip.
Yeah, if it's the only place to get it, you pay the premium. The necessity kind of trumps the cost increase.
Exactly. That necessity, that resilience.
Huh.
It leads right into this whole idea of TSMC's, well, surprising geopolitical weight.
Geopolitical weight. for company.
Yeah. The thinking explored here is that some corporations, because they perform such a critical function that nobody else can wield influence that actually rivals or maybe even exceeds that of some countries, and not just in financial terms.
How does that work? How does a company get state-level influence?
Well, Tenenbaum put forward this really interesting argument. It's almost like TSMC protects Taiwan, not just the other way around.
The company protects the state. How?
Because TSMC's fabs are so critical to the entire global economy, to technology everywhere. Their physical location in Taiwan makes the island strategically vital to everyone. The U.S., China, Europe, Japan.
Ah, I see. So disrupting Taiwan means disrupting the world's chip supply.
Precisely. It creates this kind of silicon shield. Messing with Taiwan has potentially catastrophic economic consequences globally, which gives everyone pause. It arguably enhances Taiwan's security in a way traditional military power alone might not.
That's a fascinating dynamic, the company as a shield. And the sources even hinted they could use this power diplomatically.
Yeah, there was speculation they could potentially say, limit sales to countries that don't have formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan. They mentioned examples like Paraguay, Guatemala, Nauru countries that do recognize Taiwan. It suggests using market power for foreign policy goals.
That's wielding corporate power on a whole different level.
And when you compare TSMC to other powerful players discussed like, say, vaccine makers during COVID or historical oil giants, TSMC's situation feels different. More concentrated, maybe. Especially at that very top end of technology.
Less competition at the absolute peak.
Right. While others were powerful, TSMC's control over the most advanced node manufacturing seems almost total right now.
And Tenenbaum also touched on their strategy for building outside Taiwan, right? They're very picky.
Extremely selective. Reportedly turned down offers from wealthy places like Singapore, Qatar, even India.
Why turn down rich countries?
Various reasons cited. Concerns about political stability in some regions, maybe not having the right kind of highly skilled workforce readily available.
Or maybe not wanting to create future competitors.
That too. Potential competition down the line. They seem incredibly careful about where they replicate their most advanced capabilities, protecting the crown jewels, so to speak.
Okay, so given this picture of near total dominance at the high end, what about competitors? Who's even trying, according to the sources?
Well, the main name that comes up is Samsung. They're presented as the closest rival.
But lagging.
Significantly lagging, yeah. A key sign mentioned was Samsung apparently losing Google as a major client for advanced chips, with Google reportedly moving to TSMC.
Ouch. And Tenenbaum highlighted a technical problem for Samsung.
Yes, a big one.
Yeah.
Yield rates. Basically, the percentage of chips on a silicon wafer that actually work correctly.
And TSMCs are good.
Incredibly good. Maybe 80%, 90% yield on mature processes.
Mm-hmm.
Samsung, for some advanced chips, was reportedly struggling with yields as low as 20%.
20%? That's terrible for cost.
Exactly. Massive difference in efficiency, cost, reliability. Makes it very hard to compete head-to-head on the really tough stuff.
Okay, who else? Intel.
Intel gets mentioned, of course, the former king.
Yeah.
But the sources paint them as having kind of lost their way in leading-edge manufacturing over the past decade. They're trying to catch up, launching new AI chips, but struggling to sell them against NVIDIA and not seen as a direct threat to TSMC's foundry leadership right now.
And what about Chinese companies? Like Huawei?
The sources say they just don't have the ability to make comparable advanced chips themselves. They're years behind.
So they rely on others.
They have to. They end up using modified, less powerful chips from companies like NVIDIA, which, guess who manufactures those?
TSMC.
Bingo. Still dependent on TSMC, even for the slightly dialed-back versions.
It really paints a picture of just how deep the reliance is for the big U.S. tech firms. Apple, Google, NVIDIA.
Absolutely. If Apple wants to make the chip for the next iPhone, the A-series or M-series chips, they essentially have no choice but TSMC, right?
Regardless of where the phone itself gets assembled later.
Exactly. As Tenenbaum apparently framed it, without TSMC making those specific chips, these flagship products just don't happen.
And things like Google moving its business, NVIDIA sticking close, it sounds like the industry itself is betting on TSMC staying on top.
That seems to be the strong signal, yes. The industry votes with its purchase orders. And Tenenbaum also brought up that interesting NVIDIA situation after the U.S. export bans on the most powerful AI chips to China.
Right, they couldn't sell their top-tier H100 chips there anymore.
So NVIDIA, very quickly, developed a modified, less powerful version specifically for the Chinese market. The H20, I think it was.
Okay.
And crucially, They used TSMC's manufacturing capacity to build these, maybe capacity that wasn't fully booked, making the absolute top-end stuff.
Ah, so it created extra business for TSMC too.
Exactly. A win-win for them, in a way. But the sources conclude this whole dynamic just reinforces the technology gap.
Oh, so.
Because the leaders, TSMC, NVIDIA, Apple, they're key partners. They're collaborating on the very edge, pushing it forward together. While others are using either older tech or the slightly constrained export version chips, it sort of pulls the leaders even further ahead.
That makes sense. This kind of leadership, staying ahead, it must require looking way, way down the road.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This isn't quarterly thinking. Making these chips is incredibly complex, take a long time.
How long?
The sources mentioned something like 7 months just to produce one complex chip, from starting the wafer to the finished product.
7 months for one tiny chip.
Right. So the company's at the heart of this, TSMC, NVIDIA, and you absolutely have to include ASML.
The Dutch company.
Yeah, the ones who make the unique, incredibly complex lithography machines, especially the EUV machines that are essential for the most advanced processes. Nobody else makes them.
Okay.
These companies, they operate with a really long horizon. They're planning 10, even 20 years out. Their futures are all kind of tied together.
And looking even further ahead, the sources mentioned AI potentially changing the manufacturing process itself.
Yeah, that's a big theme. AI could significantly boost efficiency in these already complex fabs. Estimates mentioned were average gains of maybe 25–30%.
That's huge in manufacturing.
Massive. It feeds into this whole race for automation. You hear talk about fully robotic factories, lights out manufacturing in the future.
Is TSMC there yet?
Not fully robotic, no. Their current fabs still need a pretty large, highly skilled human workforce. But the trend, potentially sped up by AI, is definitely towards more and more automation.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We've covered a lot. TSMC's unique competitive monopoly.
How it managed to push back against, well, superpowers' demands.
Its surprising geopolitical role, the Silicon Shield idea.
And what this all means for global tech, the competition, or lack thereof, and this widening gap.
Right, and as Tenenbaum stressed, in these fast-moving areas, especially AI, critical tech, supply chains, you have to keep reassessing constantly.
The whole geopolitical landscape can shift really fast. Understanding who holds the keys, and right now TSMC holds some very big keys, is just crucial.
It really does make you stop and think, doesn't it? You have huge nations, the world's biggest tech firms, all incredibly dependent on this one company for their most vital components.
And its power, both technological and geopolitical, seems to be growing.
So the final thought maybe for you, the listener, is what does this dynamic tell us about power in the 21st century? Are we entering an era where these indispensable global corporations are starting to carry as much weight, or maybe even more weight, than traditional countries on the world stage?
That's a deep question, and it flows right out of everything we've discussed from the sources. Definitely something to mull over.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into TSMC's world and its huge impact. Hope it gave you some things to think about.
Yeah, stay curious.